Today, Rosh Hashanah is also known not just as the Jewish New Year, but as Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment. We've come on this day, of course, when we look in the liturgy, to crown God sovereign. And we think of God standing on or sitting on a throne, begging as we come before God when we read the Unei Tanei prayer to be written into the book of life. But what judge are we crowning? What kind of God are we honoring? The popular image, I think, is clear. God sits high above, distant, far removed. He or she is the unmoved mover who weighs our deeds with perfect objectivity, cold justice, divine impassibility, a judge who feels nothing when passing a sentence. This image has dominated Jewish theology since the time of Maimonides, who understood God as the unmoved mover based primarily on Neoplatonic and Aristotelian imagery and thought. But what if we can argue that that image of God may in fact be inadequate for us today? What if the Torah teaches us about a different version of that same God? But instead of God who judges in an unmoved, moving way, in a cold, passive way, rather it's God who feels viscerally the impact of those very judgments. God whose judgments actually cost something to God as well. One who feels the weight of every single verdict. On Yom Hadin, we crown not an unmoved judge, rather the judge who feels the pain that we feel. That is why mercy may be in fact the true crown of God. In the Akedah that we read this morning, Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac. It's the pragmatic text of the entirety of Rosh Hashanah. Every single year, on this very day, on this very morning, we read about Abraham almost sacrificing his son. We read that God tests Abraham. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and offer up your son as a burnt offering. And Abraham obeys. And Abraham raises his knife. And then he says, Al tishlach echa el anar. Don't send your hand against the lad, but offer up a ram instead, tachat bano, in place of your son. Why does God stop the sacrifice? Well, the usual answer that's given is because God never intended it to happen. After all, it was simply a test of faith. But here's a midrashic theological story that I think challenges that very understanding. Hidden in the verse of the prophet Zechariah, Hanogea b'chem nogea b'vat eno. Whoever touches you touches the pupil of his eye, his meaning God's eye. Notice the literal thread. Adonai Yireh, the Lord will see, provide, from the Akedah, and Zechariah's imagery of God's eye. It's no accident, so the Midrash argues. The harm to Isaac, the harm to any child, would be like touching the eye of God. Can you imagine somebody touching your eye? Personally, I find it very challenging whenever I go to the eye doctor to have any drops put in my eye. But metaphorically, I think it's even more potent. It's visceral. It's physical. I'm choosing, by the way, the image of God that the Kabbalah pushes, that Heschel picked up on. I am not focusing on the one that Maimonides emphasized. God is vulnerable in this understanding. God can be hurt. In harming human beings, it harms God directly. God stops, therefore, Abraham from hurting Isaac because it would hurt God's very self. The Akedah isn't just a test about Abraham's faith. Rather, it's a demonstration of God's vulnerability. God stops the sacrifice not because it was never intended, but because watching Isaac suffer would cause physical pain within God. Something so unbearable. And that may sound slightly radical. Again, for many of us, God is so transcendent, so distant. But this theology is asking that we think very differently of God. The Torah, when we read in Deuteronomy, talks about what happens at the end of capital punishment when a human being is hanging on a tree. And it says that we are not allowed to even desecrate the victim of capital punishment. Rather, we are supposed to bury him the very next morning. But what's interesting is the sages focus because doing so would be a disgrace against God. Halal in the Hebrew. Because we are all created in God's image. Whether we are good or do good or bad or do bad, we are all in the image of God. But Rabbi Meir picks up on something different. He focuses on that word, affront, kalan. But he says, when a person suffered, what does the Shekhinah say? It's not just an affront. It causes inner pain. My head hurts. My arm hurts, is what Rabbi Meir writes. It's preserved for us in the Talmud. He is speaking metaphorically. When you suffer, God hurts. When we are in pain, God's head hurts. God's arm aches. When the Shekhinah, the very presence of God in this world, experiences somatic pain when human beings suffer. The Talmud applies this, like I mentioned, in executions, when it's believed the punishment is justified, when justice demands. But even in that moment, when justice demands, when it's thought that it is imperative to commit that act as a state, God feels the cost. Can you imagine if God feels the cost for somebody who was a criminal, all the more so, Rabbi Meir later argues, does God feel the cost for all of us? Because God experiences physical discomfort. And think about what this means even further if we were to push Rabbi Meir's philosophy and theology just a few more steps. It means that every single verdict that God renders costs God something. The justice isn't free. Rather, there's a price to pay even for it. The rabbis understood this radical teaching when we look and see that Rashi felt compelled to explain and mitigate just a little bit what Rabbi Meir was saying when he translates my head hurts into I feel a burden, metaphorical rather than physical. The fact that Rashi, who wrote commentary on the entire Talmud, felt the need in this case to soften Rabbi Meir's original words tells us just how powerfully radical those images and that thought was. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, a modern Orthodox rabbi who translated into modern Hebrew and English, adding his own commentary to the Talmud, offers and focuses back onto Meir's literal meaning. I am pained in my head, I am pained in my arm, and he makes a stunning leap in his commentary. If God suffers over the blood of the wicked that is spilled, how much more so over the blood of the righteous? God suffers not just when good people are hurt, but even when wicked people are punished. Even justified execution causes God pain. Even deserved consequences makes God head hurt. God couldn't stomach the pain that Isaac was enduring. It caused God pain just to bear witness to Isaac's suffering. This isn't isolated, by the way, of the Torah describing divine body or what the body of God is experiencing. Rather, what we see is something different. We read in the Psalms, Imanochi b'tzara, I am with him in distress. Not I observe his distress, I am with him in his distress. B'kol tzartem lo tsar. In all of their afflictions, God is afflicted in Isaiah. In the Hebrew, of course, playing with the word tsar, narrow and distress. When we're in a tight place, when we're confined, when we feel fear, God is in that tight place with us. God is constricted. God feels fear. And my soul weeps in secret places, says Jeremiah. God has secret places too of weeping. Of course, that was the weeping prophet who was frequently using that imagery of weeping. But what the Talmud hears of that very phrase is that God's tears, God cries when we cry. And when those tears of God's fall, they shake the foundations of the world. The text doesn't prove God had a physical body, but the biblical authors choose body language deliberately to teach us that covenantal love is felt, it's not observed. That there's a visceral component to our faith. It's not just something we think about, it's something we experience. God doesn't watch our pain from a distance, God experiences our pain from within. And so on Rosh Hashanah, crowning God as sovereign, crowning God as a judge, we're not crowning some distant, unmoved mover. Rather, we're crowning a God who feels, whose head aches in human pain. And this, of course, I think changes so much. If we imagine God this way, if we live God out this way, what that means for us is how we think about divine justice is fundamentally different. God's justice isn't some cold calculation. It costs God something. And when God judges, God suffers. The standard then, therefore, is not perfection. The standard is mercy. It's understanding. It's taking the time to see who the other person is and recognize how they arrived at the place that they are at. Why are they suffering needs to be our question. It changes how we judge others. If God's head hurts and renders judgments, why and how can we be so quick to condemn? How can we feel triumphant when our enemies suffer? The Talmud tells us this midrash, which is so powerful that the Reform rabbis put it in our Haggadah. It says that when the Egyptians were drowning in the sea, God restrained the angel from singing. Ma'aseh yada tovim bayam vayetem omrim shira. My handiwork is drowning in the sea and you want to sing? Don't be triumphant when our enemies suffer, because they suffer just as you might suffer too. And suffering causes God pain. And lastly, it challenges our understanding of tshuva. When we're not asking forgiveness from a God who is untouched by our failures, we're asking forgiveness from God who has felt every single wound that our failures have caused, who has experienced all of the harm that we have perpetrated against others, who recognizes that the other person who was hurt needs forgiveness just as we hurt inside too. It's not a theology. Rather, I think Rabbi Meir's words are in fact a call to action. But the action that it's calling us toward is mercy, of a deeper understanding of justice. It means that for him, for Rabbi Meir, justice is repairing harm, not because it's just wrong to cause harm, but because in causing harm, we've caused God physical pain, we have hurt the other, and we have hurt ourselves. And that is what we need to rectify. Because in rectifying that, we redeem somebody that's been othered or undignified and recall that they are created in the image of God. When others fail, we must resist the urge to celebrate. When others fall, we must resist the urge to dance. Because God feels their pain too. And in our families and in our community, our society, we must choose merciful healing over punishment whenever possible, because even necessary consequences cost God something. Even justified judgments make God's head ache. Today, we crown God as sovereign, but the crown we place is not one of distant power. Rather, it's one of shared vulnerability, the cost of judgment, of love that literally hurts. Hayom hara'at olam. Today, the world is conceived. Something new is being born through labor pains of divine justice. And the midwife is a God whose head hurts, whose arm aches, and whose tears shake the world. Let our response be worthy of such a judge. Let our crown be of mercy, one that we too can crown ourselves wearing into the year ahead, showering not just ourselves, but those around us with compassion, mercy, and understanding. Shana Tova u'Mituka. May we all be blessed with a year of compassion.